Chapter 1, Bigfoot and the Henriksons. John Henriksen glanced in the rearview mirror. His teenage daughter, Maggie, was staring out the window with the same look of frustrated boredom she had worn since they'd left the house 9 hours ago. The expensive headphones covering her ears prevented intrusion from the deep and otherwise penetrating snores coming from her younger brother, Josh, slumped in the seat next to her. John let out a sigh as he looked across to Melinda, his wife. She was fixing him with a stare that warned her own tolerance of the journey was dangerously close to collapsing. "Maybe we're a little too early in the season," he offered apologetically. "You think?" Melinda replied, a little short but as good-naturedly as she could manage. "If the next one is shut too, we'll just stop at a motel in the next town. We don't have to camp, and you'll cover the extra $60 a day we'll have to budget for," she scolded. He half smiled at her, thinking it would be a small price to pay compared to the nagging and told-you-so attitude he'd have to put up with otherwise. And the thought of a warm, comfortable double bed certainly had more allure than the camping cots stowed away in the trunk. So far, they'd been to 4 camping grounds, only to find thick chains across the entrances of each. He fixed his eyes on the road, guiding what had been his father's 1987 Ford County Squire Station wagon through the sweeping curves of the scenic forest setting of North Washington State. Towering pines, sequoia, and oak rose in steep banks on either side, the road climbing the mountain in natural undulations and tight corners. The car leaned and wallowed in these, showing its age with tremors along the chassis and groans from the suspension. "Even the cars had enough," Melinda said, rolling her eyes. As they rounded the next bend, John spotted the damaged sign out of the corner of his eye. He couldn't make out the first part, but the word campsite was still readable. He had to stamp on the brakes to avoid shooting past, but he wasn't too worried, having not seen a car in the rear view mirror for hours. Melinda and Maggie glared at him, but weren't ready to escalate into all-out argument yet. He stared out of the window at the track that led into the darkness beneath the trees. It was heavily overgrown, but something in the pit of his stomach was telling him it was worth exploring. He turned the wheel and pushed the car over the grass verge. The suspension bucked and protested along the deeply rutted trail, but after a slight rise, it was all downhill, and he coasted the car down to the campground. The first spring flowers had already begun to push themselves through the knotted mass of overgrown grass. Red columbine, bearberry, and great commas dotted the meadow. Surrounding it were clumps of fireweed, and beyond them were the trees. By the close clumping of the trunks, John guessed it had once all been Forest Service land. He turned off the engine and looked back at Melinda, who didn't seem quite so enamored. "You're not serious, are you?" she exclaimed. "What's wrong?" "It looks great," he replied, offended. "It looks deserted," she snapped back. "What about toilets? We've got tissue and wipes." "Back to nature, baby," he replied, smiling smugly. "I thought it was only bears who shit in the woods," she said shrewdly. John checked his phone. It had 1 bar of signal, and he tapped on the GPS app he'd installed. It took a while to load, but eventually the screen became populated with green and white squares, and a yellow roadway that led to the north. The area known as Paradise, on the southern slopes of Mount Rainier, was a little over 3 miles away. "How about a compromise?" he suggested. "I'm listening," Melinda shrugged. "We camp here, but we head to Paradise for dinner at the inn. Means we don't have to do anything but set up the tents. And if it's not working out, we move on tomorrow. But for now, we get out of the car, get the tents up before dark, and don't have to cook." "Sold," Maggie interjected from behind. Melinda rolled her eyes, but couldn't quite hide her smile. John woke up Josh, who was more taken with the campsite they had to themselves. John watched as the 12-year-old boy busied himself with getting the tents from the trunk and putting them up. There were 2 modern dome tents for his parents and his sister, and his own backpacking bivouac and cover, which offered slightly more basic shelter. As soon as he'd finished one of the dome tents, he offered it to his sister, who hadn't budged from the car. She grabbed her bag and flung it into the empty space beyond the door flap. Josh grinned as he bolted back to the car for one of the camp beds. He passed it to Maggie as he sped past, ready to get going on his parents' tent. John stopped him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You set yourself up. Me and Mom will do ours." "Mine won't take a minute, though," Josh offered. "Gives you more time to explore," John offered. "It certainly looks and smells like uncharted territory." Maggie called from inside her tent. Josh had his tent set up within a few minutes, with just a roll mat and his sleeping bag pushed inside. A clear strip of plastic, which would be by his head when inside, would give him a brilliant view of the stars and any wildlife that wandered into the camp. He'd seen deer, turkey, and even a black bear once. There was just enough space in the entrance for his backpack to sit upright. He left it there and returned to the car to grab his hiking boots. He headed straight for the far tree line. It was cool and dark between their branches, and he knew he wouldn't have to go too much higher before he would find snow clinging to the frozen ground. He did his coat up and stood for a moment. He noticed a Lewis's woodpecker, flicking its tail and watching him from a bough high above. In the close grouping of the trees, it and everything else was in silhouette, but its size gave it away. There was no real path to guide him, so Josh decided to make his own. He intended to circle the campsite in a wide arc, not straying too far, but getting a good idea of the surroundings at least. Straight through the maze of trunks, about 100 feet ahead of him, he could see a large, wide stump. Beyond that, the trees seemed to close in, and he couldn't see much further. He decided to head towards the stump and use it as a marker to turn south, back towards the far border of camp. He picked his way through the towering trunks, occasionally having to pull branches out of his way or duck to avoid thicker, protruding limbs. He had gone about 30 feet when something made him stop. The dripping melt water, the call of crows, even the sound of his boots digging into the dirt and slime, had filled his ears until that moment. But it had all been replaced with unnerving silence. He'd been keeping his gaze trained on the ground as he picked his path, but now he looked up sharply on alert. Nothing. He squinted in the low light at the stump. For a second there, he thought he'd seen something, a glint of reflected light. Only now did he realize how big it was. At least 6 feet high and nearly 4 feet across. It piqued his interest, making him wonder what species of tree it could be. He looked down as he lifted his foot over a low, torn branch that lay across the ground. Immediately, there was a sharp, savage-sounding grunt from up ahead. Josh froze again, this time in fear. His eyes slowly rose, once more seeking out the stump. Nothing had changed, but the remnants of an icy breath of water vapor clung to the air in front of it. Josh shuddered as he realized his own labored breathing was creating similar clouds of mist. Just then, he heard his mom calling in the distance. He turned instinctively to look. The movement he caught in the corner of his eye stopped him, and his head snapped back to the stump one more time. It wasn't there anymore. That was as much as he could take, and he broke into a run, crashing back through the trees in a straight line towards the safety of the camp. As he burst back out into the sunlight, a rock the size of a softball flew past his head and smacked into the side of his hammock. He came to a stop and stood trembling for a moment, unsure if he should turn around. When he did, the ominous feeling he'd felt among the trees had vanished. Bird song had returned, and the sounds of his family laughing and going about camp business filled his ears. He went to join them, Tilda despite being quiet, and back from his exploration of the forest a little earlier than expected. John put Josh's edginess down to being tired from the journey. He checked on him with an occasional glance in the rearview mirror. As they headed to dinner at the Paradise Inn, the boy stared out of the window, his brow wrinkled, and his eyes darting to the trees with a nervous energy and intensity that seemed unusual. John decided to try and talk to him when they were back, after a good meal. After all, the quickest route to the heart was through the stomach. By the time they had piled into the Paradise Inn's dining room, good spirits overtook them all, and Josh's disposition became solely focused on the long, generously plated buffet table. John and Melinda also ordered some extra entrees from the menu. As a reward for the long journey and the possible cold night ahead, John felt much more reassured that things were going well, and they would soon be settled at the campsite. Despite its relatively rustic amenities, they'd all cope, even Maggie. They'd soon get into the spirit of things. By the time dessert came around, he had completely forgotten about trying to talk to Josh. He tipped the waiter extra for an unopened bottle of red wine to be subtly delivered to the table, which he slipped into his jacket for later. Melinda would appreciate seeing in the holiday with style, and with the kids in their own tents for the first time. Who knew what else she might be in the mood for? It had been a while, no reason other than busy, tired lives, he thought. That's what vacations were for. They were still laughing and roughhousing as they made their way back to the car. The night had crept up on them, and John checked his watch. It was a little after 9. They'd been out longer than he thought, but that was okay. He was glad they'd set the tents up and had nothing left to do but climb into their cots when they got back. He'd start a fire, though, just to be sure and safe. The Washington woods at night harbored more than just trees after all, and he liked the firelight too. The warmth, the glow. It felt good to sit around a fire and take it all in. John went slow on the road back, wary of deer that might dash across as he passed. He always wondered why they did that. Wait to the last moment. They always waited until you were right on top of them, testing your reflexes and heart condition at the same time. In the dark, it was even more difficult to spot the entrance to the campsite. As before, he had to stamp on the brakes to avoid shooting past. He pulled the car around and onto the track. He was more confident this time, and the car bucked and strained even more than the first time. The kids laughed it off as Melinda rolled her eyes, smiling contentedly. As John applied the brakes sharply a second time, bringing them to an abrupt halt, the smiles and laughter vanished. "What the hell?" John stammered, peering over the steering wheel through the windshield. Melinda followed his gaze. She felt the piercing looks of the children behind her. It was as if a tornado had been through the meadow. Maggie's tent to the far right had been torn in half, revealing a mash of poles and mangled nylon. The contents of her bag were strewn around the meadow. It was the same for the others too. One of the camping cots, impossible to tell whose, had been bent and crumpled into a ball like papier-mâché, then deposited into the boughs of an oak some 20 feet up. Josh's tent had been reduced to shreds. The split and ruined frame poked out of the ground, where the rest of it had been hammered into the earth. But it was John and Melinda's tent that drew their attention. 4 long slashes had been clawed along the side that faced them. They sat in silence for what seemed minutes. Then John opened the door and stepped out of the car. It hadn't rained, but a dank smell hit his nostrils, a putrid mix of musk and urine. The headlights were the only source of light, and offered 2 thin corridors of illumination, stretching from the car to the trees at the back of the meadow. John took a few steps forward, each one revealing more of their possessions, ransacked, destroyed, and distributed across the open ground. A cooler hung from a tree. Beer cans that had been ripped apart littered the floor below. A trail of Cheetos led into the grass and abruptly stopped. Blue polystyrene trays were all that remained of their meat stash. Hamburgers, steaks, sausage, and bacon had all been stripped from their packages, presumably devoured. John guessed a bear had found the campsite and taken advantage of their absence. He was surprised it had managed to get the coolers and storage containers open, which were meant to be tamper-proof. As he took another step forward, onto the torn remains of a sleeping bag, he flinched at the sound of a heavy impact somewhere in front of him. Whatever had made the noise was beyond the reach of the headlights, but he still peered into the gloom. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a dark shape take form. It was like a void in the shadows, blacker than the night surrounding it. Then it was gone. He turned as he heard Melinda approaching from behind. "What do you think happened?" she asked. It must have been a bear," John replied, turning back to the scene of destruction. "I want to get out of here," Maggie whined, leaning over the open car door, gripping its frame intensely. Melinda's frightened and alert eyes told John she felt the same way. "Why don't you guys get back in the car? I'll see if there's anything worth salvaging," he suggested. "Something just doesn't feel right," Melinda said, her eyes scanning the darkness as she began to back up. John looked towards the car, intending to call Josh over to help him, but the boy was still as a statue, sat in the car with his seat belt fastened. He had twisted his head around to look through the window towards the nearest grouping of trees. Something there held his attention. John slowly turned his head in the same direction. He could see nothing. The haze from the headlights dulled his vision and made the shadows blur into swirling shapes that disappeared into the vortex. He was about to look away again when a low, guttural grunt emanated from the trees. The sound hit him in the chest like a punch. As he flinched instinctively at the noise, he felt his stomach spasm in readiness to dispel his dinner. Melinda was looking at him in terror, her head snapping back and forth between John and the darkness. "Get in the car," John ordered. She was about to protest when a rock appeared out of the gloom, about the size of a cantaloupe. Melinda had just enough time to duck back into the car before it would have smashed into her head. Then John saw there definitely was something there in the gloom. It crossed the track behind the car in a single, fleeting rush of movement. Now there was nothing between it and John. It had purposefully moved around the car to get past the obstruction. John only had to contemplate its possible intentions for a moment before he was running full tilt towards the open driver's door. He grabbed at the keys in his panic to get the engine started, stamping on the gas and throwing it into reverse as it roared into life. The elderly Windsor V8 screamed at the abuse as he yanked the steering wheel round. The car pirouetted through a slush of mud and debris, scattering it across the trail in an untidy arc. John shifted into drive and felt the back end shudder as the rear tires fought for grip. For a second, they were immobile before the big car catapulted forwards, bouncing precariously along the track. Just before he swerved back onto the asphalt of the main road, the rear window shattered as a spruce limb jettisoned into the car's interior. Neither Maggie's nor Melinda's screams were enough to make him stop or even look back. Oceanoff PDF, com, Chapter 2, Code 10-20-67, Park Ranger Roger Gimlin guided the beaten-up Park Service's truck along the short patch of trail that led to the ranger's station. It was Sunday, and it was way too early in the season to expect anything like a busy day. So the old station wagon containing a family, waiting for him as he drew up, was something of a surprise. He took his time gathering his stuff, pretending not to look in their direction. 4 pairs of eyes were fixed on him, watching his every move. He swept everything on the passenger seat into his rucksack and got out. As he walked towards the ranger station and fumbled for the keys in his pocket, he met the gaze of the man sat in the driver's seat. Long wisps of graying hair sprang from his balding scalp, out of place and unkempt. Pale blue eyes met his in awkward, almost apologetic desperation. Whoever they were, they looked pleased to see him. He wondered how long they'd been there. "Guess you folks had best come on inside," he said, as good-naturedly as he could manage. He already knew the story he was probably going to get. Most likely city folk hadn't put their food away. A black bear had wandered into camp, and they had run from it, terrified. It was only as he passed by the rear of the car that he noticed the smashed back window. Just what I need, he thought, a habitualized bear that's doing the rounds and breaking into cars. He opened up the front door and went through to the main counter and desk. He switched the lights and heating on. As he began to loosen the blind slats, the family of 4 shuffled in. They found it hard to meet his gaze, looking down at their feet or nervously back out of the window towards the car. Roger walked back to behind the counter and closed the partition. For some reason, he knew people felt more comfortable when things felt more official. The snap of the wooden catch seemed to spark something in the man who had sat in the driver's seat. Roger guessed he was husband and father to the group. "We thought we should report something that happened to us last night," the man murmured. "While we were camping." Roger replied. "And what might that be, sir?" We were attacked." "Attacked?" Roger paused for a second. "Were you able to identify the animal or persons concerned?" He picked up a yellow form from one of the boxes. He asked the man for his name and particulars, slowing him down and helping him regain some control in the process. He stood in silence as he looked back over the report. "And all of you back this up? This is how it happened?" Roger asked. Each member of the family nodded in turn. "I know how it sounds," said the man, who had identified himself as John Henriksen for the report. "Sir, my job is just to take the report," Roger explained. "I can see you folks are pretty shaken up, and I don't doubt you had a horrible experience. I can see that all clear enough." He was trying to be reassuring, but knew he wasn't quite pulling it off. "A bear recently out of hibernation stumbles across a campsite, goes mad trying to get at your food. It's happened before." Something seemed to harden in the man and in his young son standing behind him. "Bears don't throw rocks," the boy objected. "And that thing when it crossed the road, it stepped," John stammered. "I remember now. The movement was like something walking on 2 legs, and it got into our food stash." "Again, sir, I'm not questioning you, but bears can rear up on their hind legs, and there's not much that'll stop one determined to get at food. They're able climbers, and once they know something's worth their while, that's kind of it. Probably somebody fed it once, and it now knows what's inside those containers." "And do they have a habit of throwing branches through windows like a goddamn spear?" the woman demanded despairingly. "No, ma'am, but you might want to consider that 2 things happen to you, not just one. Those big tree limbs come off all the time. A sudden gust of wind, and wham, it's raining branches. Just bad timing to happen straight after the bear," Roger explained as patiently as he could. He could see they weren't convinced. "I'll make sure someone looks into it, and I have your name and address. I'll get your stuff back to you," Roger offered. "In the meantime, I think you folks could do with a decent breakfast and some help with your car. Let me make a few phone calls." He took the report with him to the more private office out back and closed the door. First, he called a mechanic he knew out in Longmire, a couple of miles down the road. He wouldn't be able to replace the glass, but he'd be able to patch up the hole and get them on their way. He then called Alice Mahoney, who ran a diner in Ashford, a little further more down the road. He knew she would look after them, and it would handily get them out of his jurisdiction too. After he put the phone down, he opened the drawer of the desk he was sitting at and took out the procedure manual. It took him a little while to find the right page. Towards the back, there was little to draw attention to the phone number, other than the words that preceded it. Code 10-20-67. Report immediately. He lifted the phone receiver and dialed. It went straight to voicemail, as he knew it would. He repeated the details of the report, citing location, the file number, and an approximate grid reference. Then he hung up. The bell over the front door to the reception area chimed, and Roger was pulled away from his thoughts. He stuffed the report in the drawer and walked out of the office. The Henriksen family had taken a seat together on a bench left of the counter. Standing in front of it were a new group of people, hikers by the looks of them. "I'll be right with you folks." Roger nodded towards the Henriksen family. The hikers were just checking in, and they didn't take up too much of his time. He got them sorted and saw them on their way. "If you folks follow me, I'm going to set you up with a mechanic to look at the car," Roger beamed. "Then we'll get some food into you. Things'll seem a whole lot better, you'll see." Tilda Agent Cordell Jones listened to the recorded message a second time, glancing at the map on the wall of his dark office. A patch of yellow dots marked an area just east of Paradise and Mount Rainier. He absent-mindedly scratched at the scar underneath the fabric of the plaid shirt on his right arm. As he filled in the rest of his own paperwork, he assigned it a new case number and hesitated before filling in the final box on the form. Looking at the little nest of dots again, he took a new, singular red dot and placed it north of the yellow ones. He went back to the form and wrote possible incursion, recommend investigate, and if confirmed, termination. Oceanoff PDF, com. Chapter 3, Terror on the Trail. Jake Sutton was enjoying the challenge of an early spring hike in Washington. His senses seemed sharpened by the frost, as the scent of spruce and pine permeated his being, invigorating him and encouraging him to increase his pace. But he had volunteered to bring up the rear of the group, being one of the more able hikers. To the east lay the winding paths of the Pacific Crest Trail, which he would join again in a couple of days. Today, though, something a little gentler beckoned, and he was happy to take his time and enjoy the beautiful scenery. The group of hikers he joined were in their 50s and 60s, and he was glad of their company, as well as being able to help them out. They had found even the easier trails a little challenging, and he'd suggested an alternative, thanks to a little research and map reading. He'd use the more relaxed pace to rest a little, he'd decided, and he could part company with them once they got to the next major trail camp. One of the things he loved most about the PCT was the community. He knew that there would almost certainly be someone willing to take up his temporary mantle of unofficial tour guide. And no matter the time of year or the weather, you were never completely alone for too long. Company was usually there if you wanted or needed it. Mercifully, the path was in good condition, and the little party seemed to be enjoying themselves. Occasionally, one of them would look back and flash him an appreciative smile, or give a solemn nod of thanks. The little bit of space he afforded them was his own choosing. It gave him an opportunity to watch for any wildlife they inadvertently disturbed, usually flushing it his way. And it also gave him the opportunity to get lost in his thoughts, which was another thing about the PCT he loved. Quality time. He realized they'd gotten a little ahead of him again, and he pressed on. Tilda, the others, could sense the alpha was restless. They had returned to their grass nests at dawn as usual, but Adoti had been unable to settle. His beta and son, Kana, noticed and joined him, scanning the trees on alert. Katchar, Adoti's mate, called nervously, urging them to return to the nests. Fala, the daughter, growled sullenly. With a single commanding grunt from Adoti, they joined Kana at his side instantly. They were a close family group, and they slept, hunted, and defended their territory together. As Adoti's rumbling growl grew in his throat, Kana caught the trace of the scent his father had locked onto. There was an intruder on their patch. They moved off into the trees in a silent, sweeping formation. Tilda Jake was really beginning to enjoy himself. The pace was so leisurely that he considered it restful, and the forest was brimming with sounds and scents that enlivened him. He always found himself wondering what might just be out there, hidden from sight and creeping through the foliage. He remembered a wonderful encounter on a trail in Oregon, where a mountain lion had trotted past him, snarling at his presence before slipping back into the trees. It had taken him a while to shake off the feeling he was being stalked, but now he was glad of the experience. Another close call had come as a mama skunk, and its babies had nonchalantly walked up to him and his mountain bike, investigating at their leisure. That had been in Idaho, and the only stink he'd gone home with was his own, as his girlfriend and mother had been very keen to point out. They'd even joked the skunks could have accepted him as one of their own. He reminded himself to put in a call to them once he was back somewhere with cell reception. Tilda Adoti was moving quickly, trying to pin down which direction the intruder's scent came from. It was old but hung tantalizing in the air. He could tell it was a male, and the musky, penetrating odor hinted that it had moved into the territory purposefully. Adoti stopped and turned his body to allow him to look back at Fala. He made a soft cooing noise by pursing his lips to show his concern and affection. Both Kana and Katchar closed ranks around her immediately, and she thumped her brother in agitation. But now something else drew their attention. A series of sounds off in the distance alarmed them further. They dropped to all fours and made their way towards them. Adoti stopped at the foot of a large, broad-headed oak tree. He took hold of the lowest branch, some 10 feet high, and effortlessly pulled himself into the boughs. The others selected their own trees and did the same. From a height of about 30 feet, they were granted a view of the noisemakers. The large group of humans were slowly making their way along a forest path. Adoti knew it didn't lead deep into the trees, and it eventually turned back towards the strange, hard surface they used to travel on at great speed in even stranger contraptions. He'd broken into a few of those to forage for food, but generally he avoided people. He swung down from his vantage point. Kana and Fala, being young, were more fascinated with the humans, and had to be encouraged to give up their entertainment with a well-aimed pebble. They followed their parents along a game trail that paralleled the path the people were on, but at a higher elevation. The 4 of them stayed low, with the humans in distant earshot. Adoti was increasingly becoming more agitated, and Kana realized why, as the musky scent intensified. The male they were tracking was close. Katchar let out a long, intense breath. Adoti and Kana took immediate interest and doubled back towards her. In a small depression, where some meltwater had collected, there was a muddy impression. It was a print left with deliberate care. It was immediately obvious that the maker of the impression was even bigger than Adoti. The intruder was being brazen and blatant. In their language, Adoti was a name that meant great tree, and it was one he lived up to. His size and power had kept them safe for a long time. This male was the first they'd encountered that seemed like true competition. Adoti pushed his shoulder against his son's. Together, it didn't matter how big the interloper was. They pushed on. Tilda Jake had caught up with the others again and was already dropping back. As the group reached a bend, he let them go ahead and venture out of sight. He took off his backpack and opened it to fetch his canteen. He took a long, wholesome drink of water. As he put it back, he was suddenly aware of the unnerving silence that seemed to have fallen on the little section of forest they were passing through. He looked around. The trail was bordered on both sides by dark-colored rock formations, forming a natural corridor. A slope ascended to his right, with large boulders and rows of tobacco-barked trees marking the natural contours. Directly ahead of him, where the path turned a corner, there was an opening in the wall of rock. Grass tussocks had formed around a large, dead stump of a tree that sat in the center of the opening. It was the only place the sun could truly penetrate all the way down to the ground, and the rays of light showed steam and dust gently lifting from the hair-like bark of the stump. As Jake sat and stared at it, he smiled, thinking of what it reminded him of. If he didn't know better, he'd say that a monstrous creature was crouched in the opening, grimacing at him. He could see how somebody not used to the woods might panic, or report what they were seeing as genuine. In this light, the stump really did look creepy. He closed up the backpack and lifted it onto his shoulders. It was as he was passing the stump that he thought he heard a strange, wheezing grunt. He stopped and turned to look at it again. It made him shudder. Now a mere 6 feet from it, it looked even worse. The notched recesses of the bark looked just like thick, matted clumps of hair. In its shape, he imagined an immense, hulking form squatting down with its hands on the ground in front of it. Even this close, it was hard to tell the difference. He reassured himself that the size was wrong, as the stump stood at least 7 feet high, and nothing crouched like that would be so tall. As he looked up towards where he imagined the face would be, the stump turned its head. Whatever was looking back at him was the ugliest creature Jake had ever seen. The golf ball-sized eyes, the color of burnt amber, seemed too far apart and were housed under a thick, protruding brow ridge. The ears were very small, in contrast flat, pointed, and to the side of the head, below where the eyes sat on the face, but in line with the raised flaps of its flattened nose. He got the feeling that hearing wasn't nearly as important to this animal as sight and smell. As Jake began to back away in shock, a flash of the creature's canines, set within a powerful, square jaw, spurred him into flight. A thick, burly, 6-foot-long arm reached out and plucked him from the floor with ease. Jake yelled and bucked as he was lifted higher, his legs dangling helplessly in midair. The creature pulled him in closer, as if to examine him. Now facing it, Jake kicked out and screamed louder. Leisurely, the thing opened its mouth and sank its teeth into Jake's shoulder. As it did so, Jake felt the breath driven from his chest as it crushed him within its grip. He heard something in his abdomen pop and a crack from his ribs. There was no air to fuel the cry of pain he wanted to release. As if the struggling annoyed it, the creature dangled him at arm's length by his hair and looked him over. Jake kicked again, his foot slamming into the thing's stomach. It was like hitting rock, but the ape-like beast reacted all the same. It used its free arm to hold Jake at his injured shoulder, while its other hand began to pull at his head. Jake screamed in panic as he realized what it was doing, but it was too late. The sound of his skin beginning to tear came at the same time as the burning, searing pain. His neck broke a second later, separating from the spine. There was a pop, a rip, and then his head was separated from his body. The Sasquatch lifted Jake's flesh, wrapped skull-high above it, and drank the cascading blood that drained into its welcoming throat. It was then that it heard the noise behind it. It spun on its heels, looking up to the top of the wall of rock where it had set its ambush. It saw Adodi and Kana looking down, their teeth bared in savage smiles. It sneered in disgust, ripping an arm from the body of its prey and throwing it in their direction. Kana braced to jump and charge, but Adodi slapped a restrictive hand across his chest. Sounds were erupting from back up the trail. The people were returning. As father and son looked back down, the interloper had vanished, along with the mangled human corpse. As they returned to the trees, Adodi let the back of his finger run along an ancient scar on his shoulder, hidden by his hair, and over time, he now knew who the intruder was and how much of a threat he was. His own father had called him Shardale Darkclaw. Oceanoff PDF, com. Chapter 4, Alias Smith and Jones. Nina Lee took a deep breath, glancing at her cup of coffee that had gone stone cold. She waited for the sobs to recede at the other end of the line. She stared back over the missing person's form. Jake Sutton, 19 years of age, last heard from 3 days ago as he hiked south, away from the Pacific Crest Trail, and along the eastern border of Mount Rainier National Park. He had abandoned a group of elderly hikers he'd been with, and hadn't picked up the supply pack waiting for him at the forestry post he'd been scheduled to stop at yesterday. It had now been 24 hours, so he could officially be listed as a missing person. His hysterical mother sounded like she had been counting down the seconds before picking up the phone. People went missing all the time up here. Some even wanted to. That's what the families sometimes failed to grasp. After finishing the phone call and completing the report, she filed it and printed out the missing person poster for the board. Whilst there, she took down the outdated ones, the oldest to make space. Nina had been with the Forest Service for just over 5 years, joining straight from the University of Washington at Tacoma, despite majoring in wildlife ecology and management with a minor in forestry to boot. Her aspirations of working with wildlife had quickly been grounded. It was mainly campers, timber firms, and water treatment that took up her days. She walked through to the morning briefing. The cold had held her up, and she was the last to enter. "Now that we're all here," barked the agent at the front of the room. The unidentified agent wore darkened glasses and looked like Chuck Norris's meaner, truck-driving brother. Nina ignored his stare and took a seat. The guy had already waltzed in like he was the president, not even bothering to tell the lowly rangers which agency he and his suit-clad partner were from. Whoever they were, they seemed to make the chief and the other supervisors nervous. They didn't seem like the Forest Service's law enforcement and investigations unit types. Although his partner could easily pass for FBI, Bad Chuck most certainly couldn't. With long red hair, a hunting jacket, and a dark camouflage tee underneath, he looked more like one of the bikers that might occupy any of the local sheriff drunk tanks. He dressed like a hillbilly and spoke like an asshole. That's all Nina knew. "Anyway," stammered Marty Johnson, her boss, as he stood up, "north of the Resolute campsite is currently out of bounds and will remain so while these men are in the area." "I'm still not clear on that," another ranger spoke up. "Who are these guys and how come they have that kind of authority?" Travers was young, but spoke his mind. Nina knew everyone else was thinking the same. "Fuck you, that's who I am, son," growled the Chuck Norris wannabe. Nina glowered in her seat silently. She really didn't like this guy. "This grizzly is nothing like you've dealt with," said the agent in the suit, changing tact. "We're here to help and sort it out. We're operating a curfew and closing most of the trails for the time being. You'll also be paired up for the remainder of your patrols until we clear the area, just to be on the safe side." "Excuse me," Nina interjected, "but most of us are hunters from native backgrounds. We also deal with aggressive bears and other wildlife all the time. Why the extra precautions?" "He's a killer," snapped the Chuck wannabe, "and the reason he's a killer is because some little sweetheart like you in the Forestry Service took a pot shot at him. We're clearing up your mess. And the fact that none of us here have seen neither hair nor hide of this supposed grizzly," Nina challenged. "Trust me, darlin', that speaks volumes," Bad Chuck chimed smugly. Nina sat back, bristling at the man's rudeness. She was Crow Nation on her mother's side and Squamish on her father's, and had probably known more about tracking and handling wildlife by the time she'd turned 5 than this guy would ever know. She was certain his attitude stank as much as he did, and looked at Marty for backup. She couldn't believe he was standing for this. Marty failed to notice, as he was too busy staring at his feet. The meeting appeared to be over, as the rest of the Forest Service rangers got up and began to make their way back to their desks. Nina hung back. She noticed she wasn't the only one. Scott Travers was too, concerned his youth and brashness would get the best of him. She was determined to get to Marty and the 2 agents before him. She walked over hurriedly. "The others may be prepared to put up with this anonymous juris midiction crap, but I won't. I want to know who you guys are. I want to see your shields. And I want to see written authority. Until then, you, especially you," she declared, pointing at the rude redhead, "can check your egos in the parking lot whilst I run your plates." Marty fixed her with a look of panic that did little to dissuade her. She couldn't believe that a few seconds ago she had been worried about Travers being too blunt. The agent in the suit stood up, a half smile on his face. "Okay, settle down, I get it. My partner here can be a little forthright. My name is Special Agent Gregory Smith. This is Agent Cordell Jones," he explained, nodding towards Chuck. "Agent Smith and Jones, I'm seriously meant to believe that," Nina exclaimed. "Believe what you like, it's the truth, and it's all you're getting." Jones growled in her direction, stepping forward. "What department are you with?" Nina asked, ignoring him. "You guys aren't LEI, that's for sure." The Forest Service's law enforcement and investigation special agents were rare visitors to the remoter parks, and only ever investigated criminal cases against property, visitors, or employees, for the most part. We're from a branch within the Bureau for Land Management. Smith replied. That's even harder to believe, said Travers, who had walked up behind Nina as they were talking. She realized he was making it clear she had back up, but was keeping a respectful distance. He wasn't stepping in, but he was prepared to. She appreciated the gesture. The Bureau for Land Management are investigating an errant grizzly. Nina continued. Imagine if you can, there may be shit you don't know. Jones grinned. What I can imagine, shrugged Nina, is that's a two-way street. Marty met her gaze. He seemed more in control now, but his glance still warned her to back off. Maybe they can be of help, Marty suggested to the agents. You've got a lot of ground to cover, a lot of people to talk to. Maybe it's a case of many hands make light work. Smith gave a nod, signifying his approval to Jones, who didn't seem quite as taken with the idea. Then, smiling smugly, he reached behind him and grabbed a large pile of manila files from the table. Well, seeing how good you are at running your mouth and all, maybe you can carry out some interviews, he sneered. It'll keep you out of our hair, and we won't have to waste our time with a bunch of drunk natives. Nina glowered at the man. She was on the brink of losing control of her temper. She imagined darting forwards and slamming her elbow into his face, breaking his nose. It would be easy and satisfying, but she guessed Marty was nervous for a reason. She clenched her fists, only a little shake in her arms hinting at her pent-up fury. She snatched the files from him. Happy to be of help, she replied, turning her back. One more thing, Marty said, calling her back. The patrolling in pairs thing is mandatory. Take Travers with you. What? Nina exclaimed. Marty, there isn't a thing in these woods I haven't come across on my own before. I can handle it. Plus, up on the res, I can't vouch for his safety, especially among them drunk natives. She scowled, staring at Jones. My partner was out of line before, Smith offered. But you're close to being the same way. It's our way or no way. If you want to be involved, this is it. Nina looked at Travers. He shrugged. He was trying to look nonchalant, but he clearly wanted in. She sighed. It seemed like a hopeless fight anyway, and Travers wasn't a terrible choice of partner. Despite his youth, he was tall, well-built, and could handle himself. He was a little impetuous and thoughtless, but nothing she couldn't keep in check, and he knew not to push his luck with her, which was a major plus. As soon as her demeanor softened, his bright blue eyes sparkled mischievously. She often told him he'd only been recruited because his brown hair matched the uniform, but compared to everyone else, she knew they could at least work together. Come on, you big lug, she sighed. Travers followed her out of the room back to her desk. As she flipped through the files, she saw some familiar names. Some she dismissed, shuffling them to the bottom of the pile. Others she took an interest in and brought them to the top. Well, it might not be a dull day after all, Nina quipped, looking up at Travers. We'll head up to the reservation like they want us to, but we'll do some sightseeing on the way. Where to? Travers asked. Well, there's Lucas Christian, Nina replied, raising an eyebrow. The writer, the very one, bought a huge piece of land out in the forest and built a luxury house out there. Rumor is that it's less riding retreat, more fortress. I don't know about you, but I'd like a look around that place. Travers nodded, impressed. Then there's Patwin Dalton, owner of Dalton Logging. He's been complaining about guys from the res moving stuff around his camp, damaging equipment, and such like. And he just happens to have been the guy who sold the land to Lucas Christian. Think that's just a coincidence? Travers asked. I think it'd be interesting to see how they're linked to each other, that's for sure. Isn't it like you said, guys from the res causing trouble, with chunks of the forest being sold off? Nina sighed. No, I don't think so. But I think you're right about one thing. I think it's about territory. Let's go find out. Oceanoff PDF, com.